To say that Limbo is an enigma of a frame would be one of the biggest understatements that you could ever make. Maybe second to the operator voices are a little bad.
You'd think they'd clone something a little less ugly.
Limbo is a frame like no other. I mean, hell, understanding Limbo alone is a puzzle. Playing him adequately is an entirely different story. This guy is polarizing to both the people who play him and those around him. His powers are less of a full-blown benefit and more of a neutral force of nature, capable of being either a help or a hindrance, and in some cases it can even be both. I don't think anyone can argue with me when I say that Limbo is probably the most perplexing frame out of the entire cast right now, and yet there is no shortage of guides on how to play as him, with seemingly everyone having their own thoughts and opinions on how he should be played. But unlike many other frames, the way Limbo plays cannot be categorized so easily. And because of this, it should come as no surprise that many of these guides will collide with each other, and often they will have different opinions. Some people, for example, might say that he can only be taken in a coordinated team, while others might say otherwise. Some say he should never be using stasis, while others say it is his key focal point. And even more people would say you shouldn't be using him at all. This can lead a ton of newcomers to the frame becoming confused, because who should they believe? What is the best way to play as this space-bending magician? And another valid question to ask would be, what makes me any different? What can I add that no one else has? Well, other than the fact that many of these guides are outdated, it's also worth mentioning that Limbo is my second favorite frame in the entire game, and this has largely been because of how puzzling he is to play. I spend a large amount of free time, more than I care to admit, doing tests with a variety of different frames, weaponry, and even the game itself. It's why so many of my videos involve strange quirks and oddities. And Limbo has certainly been no exception to this, as I've shown in the past. But I've never really gone over what I've learned in all of my time playing as him. So today, I am going to be teaching you everything that I know about this frame. Some stuff you might already know, but other things you might not. I'll be showing you what builds I use for what missions, what weaponry I use, how I boost my survivability, how I use Rift without annoying the blood out of my team, and some proper Rift etiquette. So, without further ado, this is Riftbound. Now, this guide is going to be assuming that you already know the most basic of information involving Limbo, such as what bonuses you get when you're within the Rift, as well as what his abilities do in a nutshell. The guide is also going to be split into multiple chapters, so to speak, and each chapter will focus on a different part of Limbo, and they will be split into beginner, intermediate, and advanced segments. If you feel that you don't need a refresher in certain areas, you can go ahead and check the description for timestamps for each chapter. The beginner chapter is going to assume that you know the absolute basics of Limbo. In other words, you know what his abilities are, but you're not sure how to apply that knowledge to modding your Limbo, or how well he works in certain missions. The intermediate chapter will be covering what weapon types suit him the best with his kit, and this is going to be suitable information for those who know how to use Limbo, but aren't sure of what complements him. The final advanced chapters are the meat of the guide, largely focusing on practical survivability involving the Rift, as well as practical combat. And the kicker here is that these will be methods that avoid being intrusive to your allies, so you can avoid getting death threats. Simply put, the advanced chapters are where you're most likely to learn a few new things if you've already been playing Limbo for a while. Limbo is capable of doing any mission type, though obviously he has certain advantages in some missions than others. This is going to go over the three main builds that I use, as well as where to use them and how to use them. So if you're not sure how to use Limbo in certain mission types, this segment is for you. The first one that we're going to be covering is the max duration minimum range build. This build is primarily used for things like mobile defense, excavation, defense, rescue, spy, and other mission types where the goal is to defend a stationary object, or where having huge range isn't too important. Using it is pretty simple, and it's what I call an objective-focused build, which means that your main goal is to handle the objective, not the enemies. Although it can work when it comes to enemy slaying, but I'll get into that later. This particular build will shrink your Cataclysm to an easily manageable size, which is then plopped down onto whatever target you have in mind. A build like this will result in a Cataclysm that lasts over 70 seconds, which is usually more than enough to accomplish whatever you need. On top of this, you will also have a short-ranged but very long-lasting banish for whatever you might need it for. The staple mods for this build are Continuity and Narrow-Minded, and the rest are mainly for survival. Quick Thinking and Pain Threshold are chosen to boost Limbo's life expectancy along with Vitality and Rage. Primed Flow is a pretty standard choice, though you can do without it. Lastly, Streamline and Natural Talent finish it all off. Natural Talent I consider a must-have for Limbo personally, and Streamline is just nice to have in general. You could replace something like Primed Flow for something like Constitution if you want the longest lasting abilities possible, but I personally don't need it, so I've opted to exclude it from this build. This build is what makes things like Mobile Defense and Rescue such a cakewalk for Limbo. Anything where killing isn't too important is where Limbo absolutely shines. So if you're new to Limbo, just remember that your best friends are missions like this. Now, in something like Defense, you're going to need an adequate team to mow down the mobs in order to keep the mission flowing, but it also works pretty well there as well. And my god, it works especially well with Operative Defense that you occasionally get in sorties. See, instead of having to babysit a brain-dead AI, with this build, Limbo does the equivalent of giving your child an Xbox and letting that raise them while you sit on the couch drinking your life away. Okay, so there might be a few Limbo players that are looking at this thing, and if you're subscribed to the channel, you might be thinking, but no, wait, hear me out, okay? This build is going to throw a lot of people off, so I'm only going to cover it very briefly for now and then move on. I'll discuss this in greater detail later. Simply put, the objective here is to get as low of a duration as possible. In this case, I managed to reach 25%. Other than the obvious duration decreases like Fleeting Expertise and Transient Fortitude, I'm also a jack of all trades in all other stat areas. Like I said, this is a bit of an odd build, but I'll explain it later. Just know that this is the build that I use if you get interested in what I'm trying to show you later on. And it's mainly used for when I want to do some combat-focused activities with Limbo, and this build is not meant for protecting objectives or anything like that. Lastly, we have the Max Range build. Max Range works best in things like low-level Exterminate, Hijack, Defection, and Interception, but it can also work in things like Mobile Defense as long as nullifiers aren't rearing their ugly heads. This build is mainly going to be taken when your objective is widespread or moving in some way, shape, or form, though in some cases it can be used for slaughter, such as low-level Exterminate. Much like the minimum range build, this is best used with certain objectives. In something like Hijack, a giant cataclysm with stasis can prevent enemies from destroying your payload. In Defection, it can make transporting the Grenier field trip back to the bus a hell of a lot easier since you're not having to stop bullies from picking on your students. Simply put, if the mission involves a lot of area that needs covering, you more than likely want this build. It can also work in something like Defense, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're gonna piss off a lot of people if it slows down the mission. So in most cases, I would avoid huge cataclysms in Defense. Others may disagree, of course, but that's just me. This build is honestly pretty simple. Just slap on Stretch with Overextended, and you're pretty much set. I just copied over the usual go-to mods for my last builds, and that's pretty much it. You can also opt to fit in Rift Surge's Augment here. However, like I mentioned before, I personally do not use max range cataclysms to rack up kills. Pulling in every enemy in the universe into the Rift, I feel harms Limbo's survivability and makes him too reliant on stasis plus melee just to get some adequate killing in before a corrupt shotgun blasts a hole in your chest. Put simply, Avoid using it if you're not sure how your team will react when the mission involves killing to progress. Do use if the mission just involves halting and annoying enemies. Limbo is a frame that heavily relies on his weaponry whenever he has to hold his own in combat, so these weapon choices are not ones that I make all willy-nilly. But to make a long story short, in most cases you want to pick weapons that can deal high amounts of damage in bursts rather than sustained damage. Examples would be the Triburos Prime, the Lens, sniper rifles like the Lanka, and so on. This is because in most situations, Limbo is going to benefit from individual bursts of damage that can kill trash mobs in one hit, rather than a steady stream of DPS in the form of something like a Gorgon or a Soma. And this might confuse a lot of new players because you look at something like Stasis, and then you see something like this, and you're just like, oh man, I can't wait to... Everyone. But in a practical scenario, those kinds of setups aren't too useful. When it comes to melee, in general you want to grab whatever has long range and heavy damage output. So things like the Jet Gusar, the Meos, the Glaive Prime, or the Agdarax come to mind. This is just in case you need to pop a Panic Stasis for whatever reason, and need to weed out a few enemies if you're running something like a max range Cataclysm. But in one case, I would instead bring a melee weapon that is purposefully weak. I'll explain why later on, but for now just keep that in mind. Where I see people struggle the most with Limbo isn't with objectives or anything like that. It's actually with his personal survivability. Limbo is a very squishy frame. I mean, this dude doesn't look like he could take a blow from an infant, let alone... So yeah, needless to say, many players will do things like stay in the Rift for the majority of the game, even if he can't do much to enemies outside of the Rift. A player might throw down a Cataclysm with constant stasis and rely on that for survivability, even if it hampers his allies in the process. So if I'm saying that both of those methods are impractical, what can you do? And what does practical survivability even mean? I'm going to show you a few tricks on how to boost your Limbo survivability while also letting him play in a somewhat normal manner. And not only that, it will also be of little hindrance to your team, so you can use these tricks in pretty much any team while minimizing the possibility of getting switch teleported into the abyss. You know how Nidus can utilize a single enemy to boost his survivability with the use of Parasitic Link? Well, Limbo can do something quite similar, and it involves stasis. This technique works best with a max duration Limbo, though it can technically work with most builds that aren't minimum duration. Stasis has a unique property to it in that it can cause a status effect that normally runs on a timer to freeze. So for an example, radiation normally runs off of a timer, but if you inflict radiation on a target and then freeze them with stasis, radiation's timer will freeze, but the effect will still keep going. This can result in Limbo being able to turn enemies into pseudo-decoys, as mobs will try to target the enemy, but since it's in the Rift, they won't be harmed. Though, unfortunately, radiation-afflicted mobs do not drag additional aggro, so in practice, this isn't too effective. But we're not interested in radiation. What we're interested in is bleed procs. Like I said, stasis can freeze the timer of status effects, but the status effects will keep going. So in the case of bleed, it will continue to inflict the mob with bleed damage, and it will continue to do so until it either dies or stasis runs out. So why are we interested in this? Because Life Strike triggers off of bleed procs. What this means is that you can banish a target, stasis them, and then inflict them with a Life Strike blow that causes bleed. This will turn your mob into what is basically a health dispenser, and the idea is to target a heavy unit like a heavy gunner or a bombard. The goal is to inflict a bleed that isn't too strong, since you don't want to kill the enemy as fast as possible. You want to get a bleed proc that does just enough to give you adequate heals while also keeping that mob alive as long as possible. This is why I mentioned before, that it's sometimes good to have a melee weapon that is purposefully weak. In my example, I'm using a Destreza with no crit mods, since crit hits tend to bleed my target out too fast. This technique works best with melee weapons that have a 100% chance of inflicting bleed on certain hits. The Glaive Prime's throw attacks and ground finishers are examples, while the Destreza has guaranteed bleeds on numerous attacks. Plus, this sword fits Limbo very well. I mean, look at him. The amount of bleed tick damage that you want is roughly in the 470 to 600 range in my opinion. Through testing, hitting bleed procs that deal about 470 damage will result in about 100 HP per tick, which is just enough to heal Limbo at a good rate, while also making sure that the mob lasts as long as it possibly can. Higher bleed rates will grant more HP per tick, but lower the duration of the health siphoning, since the duration is directly tied to the mob's health bar. Now of course, you might be thinking, there's no way this is practical, but you'd be surprised. Health siphoned mobs can last a ridiculously long amount of time, even at levels as low as 70. And the best part is that not only can you control how much health you want to gain, but it also scales in effectiveness as mob levels grow. Since mobs gain additional health and armor as their level increases, it means that your health siphoning can last even longer, and you can bump up how much health that you want to get as their levels grow. This technique also pairs extremely well with rage and quick thinking. If you happen to start taking HP damage, just quickly dash into the rift and regain some HP. Then just come back out, and just like that, you gain some energy for taking damage, and the damage that you did take gets refunded basically for free. There is one problem with this technique though, and it's that your allies with offensive powers can kill your siphoned target. But there is at least one way around this. Life Strike's heal does not have a distance cap, so what you could try to do is break away from your group briefly, find an isolated heavy unit, and then turn them into a health siphon and rejoin your team. As long as the group stays put and your target is far enough away, they should be safe from your allies' fury. By the way, make sure to throw a Rift Surge on them so that when their banish duration is up, it puts them right back into another banish, so this basically doubles their banish duration. If you do this, you shouldn't have to go back and re-banish them if it wears off. But regardless of that workaround, it still does require some luck from your teammates, whether or not it'll be as viable as it possibly can be. So, I've got another build that's more usable in a team, with more of an offensive payoff, albeit slightly more risky. So, we're back to this build now, so it's time to explain myself. This is a build that turns Limbo into a combat frame, and it's a little more reliable to use in a party compared to health siphoning, at the expense of hampering Limbo's ability to play objectives. But on the plus side, this isn't hampered by teammates, Limbo himself doesn't annoy his team very much, and it allows Limbo to utilize the Rift more, along with the Rift Surge augment. This build focuses on giving Limbo more control over how he banishes his enemies, how long he banishes them, and the fights that he picks. Which might sound silly due to having such a small duration, but trust me when I say, less duration does open him up quite a bit. So here's how this works. Limbo engages a group of enemies, big or small, with a banish. He then enters the rift himself and casts Rift Surge. At this point, Limbo has a few seconds to do whatever he wants before the banish of his victims wears off. Let's say he kills a few of his banished targets, but not all of them. Once banish wears off, the rest of your victims will have their surges trigger, which will knock them down and send them right back into the rift, resetting their banish duration. After this, Limbo can go for a few options. 1. He can let his banish run out and send the rest of his targets back into the material plane, resetting the situation. Or 2, he can cast Rift Surge again and extend the time that they're in the rift for as long as he can cast Rift Surge. See, Rift Surge is why this build works, and I'm going to give a brief explanation of it to those who are new to Limbo. The easiest way to see Rift Surge is as a banish trap. Basically, it's an alternate way of sending enemies into the Rift plane. If you surge an enemy that is in the Rift, the instant that they leave it, the surge trap will trigger and it will send them right back into the Rift. As a bonus, any enemies that are near the surged enemy when it goes off will also be knocked into the Rift as well. As a minor addition, killing a mob without consuming their Rift Surge will spread that surge to another mob nearby, though if it gets spread to a mob that's already outside of the Rift, the surge trap will not be primed to go off, so to speak. So the easiest way to trigger it is to instantly cast and close a Cataclysm. Anyways, back to the build. Rift Surge is the MVP of this build, because you can just keep casting Surge and keep enemies in the Rift, even though Banish itself only lasts a few seconds. Normally, Limbo has to manually banish enemies out of the Rift if he doesn't want them there. But with this build, you get to decide how long they stay just based on how often you cast Rift Surge. It's more hands-off and it allows Limbo to focus on other things while still retaining control over who is in the Rift and who isn't. You might think that this gets expensive, constantly having to recast Rift Surge every few seconds, but at 150% efficiency, and the fact that Rift boosts your energy regen, and the fact that killing Riftbound mobs gives you 10 energy, it's actually really manageable. With this particular build, Rift Surge only costs 25 energy, so you only need to kill 2 enemies to recuperate most of that cost. And this isn't factoring in the passive energy regen of being within the Rift to begin with, or things like Energy Siphon. The goal of this build is to offer Limbo the utmost control over enemies that are in his realm without him having to leave it. For one example, as you recast your Rift Surge to keep your initial targets in the Rift, you might bring in some new targets if they're around any of your surges when they go off. So you just pulled in a few new buddies without even having to leave the Rift at all. For another example, if he kills a few Rift Surged enemies and the surges spread to enemies outside of the Rift, he can then throw down and instantly burst a Cataclysm to spread a banish to mobs that might happen to be near any surges. And boom! Once again, you got new victims without having to leave the Rift and manually target a group. And if Limbo happens to bite off more than he can chew, he can opt not to recast Surge and instead let Banish on his targets wear off. What's especially useful is that Banish causes a knockdown effect. Since Banish is wearing off every few seconds and triggering Rift Surges, those surges are activating and they're pulling them back into the Rift, which causes more knockdown effects. This happens extremely often, and it gimps enemies that are in the Rift because of it, often causing chain knockdowns and rendering a giant chunk of enemies that are in the Rift helpless, without even needing stasis. See, if you were rolling a more normalized build, with normal duration, normal range, and things like that, any and all mobs would be free to shoot you while you're in the Rift, since Banish would not be wearing off as quickly and triggering those surges to cause knockdowns. But here, every few seconds, a surge is knocking enemies right back down to the ground and potentially pulling in even more mobs into Limbo's smoke pit. Of course, it's not consistent. If a surge pops while a mob is in the middle of a hard animation, they won't suffer the knockdown. But it still affects them very often, and it makes the Rift a safer place to do your killings in. This means that stasis is not a necessity, and you can opt not to use it. This makes this build far less annoying for your teammates, since any target that you fail to kill will be sent right back into the material plane after just a few seconds if you happen to forget about them. This happens without you having to find those stragglers to manually throw out of the Rift yourself. All you have to do is wait. That way, no enemy gets wasted in the Rift and your allies all get a shot at something that you happen to miss. This build makes Limbo more of an independent combat frame, and it meshes in with a team rather well. Though, beware, it does result in cataclysms that only last a few seconds, so his objective defending potential for missions like defense, excavation, and so on will be hampered if you use this build. Now we're going to end with what I believe is proper Rift etiquette. aka how not to be an hat. Limbo is a frame that wields immense power, so he has a responsibility to use it appropriately and to avoid annoying his allies. So here are a few guidelines on proper Rift usage. First off, do not use Cataclysm and Stasis if the goal of the mission is to kill stuff to progress. This includes things like survival and defense. Unless your entire team is composed of a Peacemaker Mesa, an Exalted Blade Excalibur, and a Molecular Prime Nova, you're just going to be hindering your team more than helping them with that setup. Secondly, banish teammates only if they ask for it, or if you must, use your intuition to see if it would be appropriate, such as if you see a friendly Excalibur running around with his Exalted Blade. He would be an appropriate target to banish, as the sword waves will hit enemies that are in both the material plane and the rift plane. If they say stop, no matter the reason, no more! Third, avoid banishing absolutely every enemy. Not only is this bad and hard to manage for Limbo, it can annoy your team as Riftbound enemies can still be hard to see, even with all the update to the Rift visuals. Take small chunks of enemies into the Rift, not everyone. 4. If a particularly vulnerable ally is being swarmed while they're reviving someone, drop down a Cataclysm with Stasis, but pop it after they're done reviving. Lastly, use of your Rift Portal can be quite handy, as it provides a 15-second banish on any ally that goes into it, regardless of your power duration. You can toss this on top of a downed ally while reviving them to give them some additional energy regeneration while you're getting them up. They don't have to move into the portal either, so a good idea is to drop it on top of the downed ally, then revive them. By the time they're up, assuming that you're the only one reviving them, the banish will be almost gone in most cases. You can also drop the portal near a downed ally so that any ally that comes to help them up as well will also gain the bonus of invincibility. They can then leave whenever they choose to. And that is the end of the guide, guys. Holy I did all of this recording in one sitting at 3 in the morning. I'm hoping that this guide will help out at least a few people that are struggling with Limbo. Whether they're new or old, doesn't matter. As per usual, I'm not very good at ending videos, so bye!